Hey guys, so another brilliant performance from Manchester United in Europe. Brilliant 4-1 victory against Istanbul Basaksehir. So now we're going to in this stream we're going to be looking at the secrets of how we played well, what we did so well, and how Istanbul in some senses play into our hands, and some concerns again for what happened in the second half and how that might affect us, what we might expect to see against Southampton at the weekend. So obviously, I think in general, United did the basics fairly well, especially in the first half, using the whole playing area, making sure we stretched the pitch as much as possible, making it really hard for the defence to sort of track our runners, and in that sense, we were fantastic in the first half. Donny van de Beek and Bruno Fernandes, the two key players for me. Van de Beek, obviously in the pivot here, he was so good at moving that ball forwards quickly, and if he didn't move it forwards, rather than just making a nice basic 5-yard sideways pass, he'd always make sure to get that ball as far away out of that danger area as possible, so that those players who were pressing were then exposed and out of position. So Van de Beek was really good in the way he kept it simple, kept the tempo up of the game, and I was really impressed with his performance. Now, in terms of the first half in general, the main thing from a tactical perspective that was interesting was the way Istanbul decided to press United. So what they had was when United had the ball with our centre-backs or with David De Gea, rather than just Demba Ba going forwards and pressing, obviously by himself he's likely to get outnumbered there because you've got the keeper and the two centre-halves, so it's a 3v1, so it's difficult for Demba Ba to press that and win the ball back by himself. So what Istanbul did was they sent Chadli up with him, and what that meant for United was that Aaron Wan-Bissaka on that right-hand side there was always open for a nice easy pass out wide. What happened then was that, obviously, if there's no further movement, that ball back in field is on. But what normally happened was Chadley's recovery run from that press, once he'd been bypassed, once that ball had gone beyond him, took him into the path of that ball back in field to Van de Beek. But at the same time as that, you have the Istanbul midfield squeezing up quickly to try and press and catch United out if we played that ball back in field. But what it meant was that United actually were able to get that ball beyond the Istanbul midfield and into our forward players much quicker and in a lot more space, because the Istanbul midfield were moving, well, not that way, as you can see on the screen, and the United forwards were moving the opposite way. So it made it a lot easier for United to get the ball to our forward players in a lot of space, allowing us to exploit the gaps in between the Istanbul defenders, and 1v1, United's forward players were fantastic in this game. Now, the other thing, obviously, that happened for the second goal in particular was Chadli's recovery run didn't quite get him back fast enough, so Van de Beek was able to get that ball. So Wan-Bissaka was able to pass that ball back in field because it wasn't cut off by Chadli. And what he then did was he played a nice quick flick into the path of Fred, knowing that Fred, if he saw what was going on, would be able to get beyond that midfield, who are moving in the opposite direction, and he'd be then able to sort of play the ball forward. I think it was out to Tellez, crossed in, and ended up in the back of the net. So what was so impressive there was Van de Beek's all-round awareness to know that, what a sense, and know what Istanbul were doing tactically in terms of pressing, squeezing, trying to force and win the ball back in that midfield area, and just so simply with a nice easy flick, allowing United to bypass that. So in the first half, that's what worked really, really well for Manchester United. Now, in the second half, obviously things didn't go quite so well for United. And the main reason for that is Istanbul switched formation a bit. Rather than having sort of a 4-5-1 or a 4-1-4-1, they went to more of a 4-4-2 in the second half. Meaning that obviously there's two players up front there, pressing the centre-backs, but also it means that Aaron Wan-Bissaka isn't an easy outlet all the time. It meant he wasn't always free and able to play those balls. In essence, it put Aaron Wan-Bissaka under a little bit more pressure. And that made it much harder for United to play out. And the other thing that Istanbul were able to do in that second half was this double pivot in midfield. Their two central midfield players were able to get in between United's double pivot of Fred and Van de Beek and Bruno Fernandes, or when the subs came on, the same thing. They got in between the double pivot and they isolated them from the attack. And that's what made it so difficult for Manchester United to retain the ball. And given that we come up against a high-pressing 4-4-2 in Southampton at the weekend, that for me is a little bit concerning. That with just a simple tactical tweak, Istanbul were able to isolate United's team into the defensive half and the attacking players and try and really stopping any link between them. What we did see though for the final goal, for that fourth goal for United, which was so impressive, was that long ball up to Cavani. If I'll drag the players back so it's a better reflection of where they were on the pitch. I'll make the subs required as well. So, but what we saw was a nice vertical pass, and it shows really the importance of verticality when you're trying to beat a high press. If you're playing horizontal square passes, it makes it really difficult to play out of a press, and really just playing yourself into trouble. So what we saw from this in this move for the fourth goal was a really nice ball from Matic. So Fernandez went off, Matic came on, Van der Beek went into the 10 roll, Dan James came on one side, and Mason Greenwood came on the other side. But yeah, what we saw on that fourth goal was a really nice ball from Nemanja Matic to Edinson Cavani. Obviously, the Istanbul defence has squeezed up because we were under pressure. It was a really good ball from Matic, straight through the middle, up to Cavani. And what happened then was that Cavani played that off straight back to Van der Beek. Obviously, that ball from Matic, through breaking those lines up to Edinson Cavani, dropped off to Van der Beek, and he then plays another vertical pass, really good ball, into the path of Mason Greenwood, who's running beyond the defence. Now, when you're playing against a high-pressing team, it's so important that you've got that vertical passing, but also that movement in behind. When a team's pressing high, obviously the main space is this area here, in behind that defence. So it was really important that we exploited that, and that is what we need to see against Southampton if we're to win that game. So for me, it was nice to see from the fourth goal, but until then, we did struggle with that. We were playing too many sideways passes. We weren't able to retain the ball. Defensively in the second half, United's block was we dropped into a bit of a deep 4-4-2. So we had with a back four, then a four of the double pivot, and Dan James and Mason Greenwood on the wings, and then Van der Beek and Cavani, or whoever was in the 10 role at some points. That was Martial for a bit as well. So we dropped into a bit of a 4-4-2, and what we saw was that it was quite compact. The defence, so for the start of the second half, I felt it was quite fairly compact. The defence did a decent job, and when the fullback did get dragged wide, which was Brandon Williams later on, when the fullback did get dragged wide, it was really nice to see Matic and Fred, or Van der Beek and Fred, covering in those spaces between the centre-back and the full-back to make sure that we didn't have too big a gap and we weren't allowing too much space in between those lines. But what happened later on is that the gap between the pivot, so between Fred and Matic or Fred and Van der Beek, it started to grow. For the majority of the second half, we weren't under too much pressure. I mean, yes, they had the ball, but it didn't look like they were creating too many chances, other than long-distance shots. What started to happen, though, is that gap between Fred and Van der Beek, it was at this point, started to become really big. So Van der Beek would be in that back line, Fred would sometimes go out roaming a bit, and it'd be left to one of Martial or Cavani to drop in and fill that space. And that put us under a little bit of pressure. It made it difficult for us to be organised, and we did start to sort of lose control of that game there. And that's when, obviously, Istanbul scored their goal from the free kick. But at that point, around that sort of time, the last sort of 10 to 15 minutes, that gap did become a little bit too big and gave them a little bit too much influence in the game. Now, the final thing I want to say is that sort of going forward, looking at this Southampton game, it's really important that we're more intelligent. We make sure we play to our strengths and we play to the opposition's weaknesses, making sure we get those balls in behind the defence. We make sure that we have vertical passing, good movement, diagonal runs, all those sorts of things, and we can come out with that Southampton game with 3 points, just like we did tonight. So, thank you for watching this. Hope you've enjoyed the tactical analysis. Obviously, a great result for United. A massive win for Ole Gunnar Solskjaer after the embarrassment last time out in Turkey. So a fantastic game, and